Hi, this is Lauren Grace from the Rainforest Art Project, and today we will be exploring texture and patterns in art. Everywhere around us there are textures in nature and patterns too. We as the artists use it to inspire our work, so let's understand the difference between them. Texture doesn't just involve our eyes, it can also call on the element of touch. Like grass, fur, sand and hair, the artist can create the illusion of texture visually with layers of paint and special techniques that can be so realistic your brain will believe it's real. Random patterns found in nature can have a rhythm and repetition like zebra stripes and ripples in sand dunes and the delicate lines in leaves, whereas man-made patterns are very precise in their repetition, as you will notice in fabric, textiles and wallpaper designs. Our first project using these ideas will be a sketch of our own hands. One will be inspired by texture and the other will be inspired by patterns. Next we'll learn some cool watercolor techniques, some of them with some beautiful texture, and with that knowledge we'll be able to create our very own work of art. So to begin with, you're just going to need a couple of plain sheets of paper, your pencil, an eraser. I've also got a Sharpie, which is something you can finish your work with. Once you've fine-tuned your pencil drawing, you could go back over it with a Sharpie. But we'll just start off with the pencil drawing initially. So you have your texture and pattern reference sheet, so you can kind of draw some inspiration from here. You might also have some favorite patterns and designs that you already know, but it's a good place to start to get some inspiration. I'm going to have my two pieces of paper next to each other. I'm going to do a sketch of my, an outline of my left hand and then an outline of my right hand, which can be a little trickier. You might want a neighbor to help you. As I'm sketching around my hand, I just let the pencil rest on my hand to kind of guide me, and I just take my time. If I rush, then the pencil is likely to jump around. And also if there's any gaps, once I take my hand away, I can just go back over those. Without my hand being there, it's just fine. Okay, what all right, let's see. So yeah, I can just kind of clean that up a little bit. So I have a ring on that finger, so that's why it gets a little bit of a strange shape right there. So I'm just going to go back over that and clean that up. Yeah, that'll do for now. All right, so here we go. Let's see if we can sketch. All right, next I can write on the top. I decide that my left hand will be texture and my right hand will be pattern. Okay, so I'm going to start with my texture hand. All right, so I love this inspiration sheet because I'm actually going to use quite a few. Patterns from here. So I can decide, well, which finger's going to be which pattern. So I'm thinking, I like this grass design. So something you want to pay attention to, this is a texture and there's also a feeling of kind of random pattern happening there. So each strand is not perfect, they're kind of slightly overlapping, maybe some going in a slightly different direction. And you can take notice of that. So if I'm choosing my thumb to be the grass, and I'm just going to kind of let that grass grow out of my thumb. But the main thing is to not do it too perfectly, because with textures and random patterns, they're not perfect. All right, so next I kind of like these scales on here. And something I'm noticing about that is kind of a half circle. Some are a little bit bigger than others. There's a little bit of shading going on as you're shading in to create a little bit of shadow going on as they overlap each other. So this one isn't actually on the inspiration sheet. This is what I'm thinking of is cracked earth, you know, when there's been a mudslide and maybe the earth has dried up so much that it actually starts to crack, and you'll see there's a certain pattern in it, but it is a random pattern. And next, I'm really enjoying these clouds here, so it just says to draw some horizontal lines and then create some semicircles, different sizes, that are stacked on top of each other. Kind of a cool description. Let's see how to do that. We've only got a very small space though, so we just kind of have to have these clouds floating by. Okay, and here I'm going to create, I'm thinking about a leaf, so I'm just going to kind of create the center of that leaf. Kind of ends here, and then all the little veins that kind of travel out. I'm loving this wool, curly inward spirals of indeterminate size and thickness that intersect each other. Give some shading between these shapes to show depth. Okay, so I'm going to start off with just kind of very light spirals, and then I can go in with a little more pressure with my pencil to shade some of those areas. Alright, so you see that I kind of put that fine layer down first, and then I came in and kind of did some more specific darker curls in there, and now I'm just going in and kind of doing a little bit of shading in some of these areas just to kind of finish it up in there. And then I want to start thinking about what to put in this wrist area. And I'm really liking this wood. All lines go in one direction. No lines are the same length or thickness. Lines will be organic and really straight. So I can start to kind of create that down on this wrist. Let me just outline this wrist a little bit more so you can see it. I'm just going back over it with a little firmer pressure on a few areas, and then doing a little bit of a lighter pressure just kind of around it, so it's not such a harsh end to one section. It kind of connects somehow with the shadows. Alright, so at this point you can decide whether you want to go back over it with a Sharpie, or if you just like it as a pencil drawing. That's your option there, if you have a Sharpie available. Otherwise I like it just as a pencil drawing. So next we're going to move on to patterns. Alright, so now we're ready to work on the right hand for our patterns. We have a few things on our inspiration sheet, reference sheet here, some common patterns you might find. You might also look around the room and see some cool fabrics around you in people's clothes. You could use that as your inspiration as well. I'm also thinking I want to break this up into sections, so I'm just going to start off with the 5 fingers, and I'm going to take that around there and give myself a little bit more room to work. Okay, so that gives me 6 spaces, and then breaking off this section here gives me 7. So I've got 7 patterns to come up with. Alright, so I'm kind of seeing some cool lines coming down the little finger, and then I can just move my work around. So I find this kind of work very relaxing and kind of meditative, so it's a nice way to relax. If ever you're getting stressed, you can just do a little bit of doodling like this with repetitive patterns. Some cool designs. Okay, so what do I want to do here? So I'm just kind of seeing a crisscross. Alright, so what about this finger? Okay, so I'm kind of seeing a cool idea here. I like those circles, so I'm thinking some circles in the thumb, maybe a slightly different idea. So a circle within a circle within a circle. And I'm just going to go back around the edge there, just to make it a little more defined. Got 2 more sections to fill. Oh, this is a fun one. I like this one a lot. So I'm just going to start by creating some soft lines, kind of soft squiggles down the hand. And then each section, this one's going to have sort of a soft upward U shape. And then on the way down, I'm going to go in the other direction. So you'll see what happens after a little while. So you can see that creates a little bit of an optical illusion, almost like a wave. So I just want to go back over those lines in between and just shade them a little bit. So here again I'm going to do a little kind of squiggly line, a little soft. There we have it. There is our patterns. So next we'll be moving forward to learn some watercolor techniques. Alright, so here we're going to learn some very cool watercolor techniques which you can take with you in your life, but you can also use on the next project we're going to be doing, which will utilize all the techniques that we learn right now. So first things first, I will show you what we have. We've got some napkins, paper towels, whatever you have handy, watercolor palette, and then a few choices of brushes. So I've got a little tiny brush there, and then I've got quite a few broader brushes which are great for the flat wash. And then I have my pencil, watercolor paper, a ruler, a straw for blowing some paint later, and then some salt, which I use for one of the techniques, as well as an oil pastel, or you can use a white crayon. Will work just as well. It creates some resistance, so it pushes the paint away. It's a cool technique. I like that one very much. Okay, so first of all, I want to break up my my watercolor paper into 9 sections. So it's just a rough guide, so I'm not going to worry about it being exact. I'm just going to break this up into 3. Okay, perfect. That'll do. Don't need that again. So my first section here, I'm going to actually create some little puddles of paint over here. So I'm just going to pop some water into each of these sections so that I get a nice lot of pigment going on. I'm going to probably use that blue quite a lot, so let's get that in there. And pick up, this one here is purple, so I'm going to give myself some purple to work with over on this side. Alright, that'll be enough to be going on with. So the first thing I want to do here is just a flat wash in this first section here. So I've got enough paint on my brush already, so I'm going to start by just taking that colour all the way across. And then I want to tilt the page upwards so that water and colour can pour down and create a very even flat colour is what we're aiming for. Is a flat wash of one colour. So you can see that there. And next I want to do a gradient. So that would be starting off with a strong colour and gradually fading out to a very light shade. I'm going to do that with the blue so you can see the difference here. Slightly different brush as well. This one's a little bit narrower. So I'm going to pick up the blue, a little bit stronger here. So I'm going to start with the colour at the top, nice and strong. See that soaking into this beautiful watercolour paper, I love that. And then I drag that down. I'm going to start washing off the colour. I'm going to give myself a clean brush and gradually move the water with a little bit of pigment in it all the way down to the bottom. That gives you a gradient effect right there. And next I'm going to completely saturate this area. So this is called wet on wet. So I have a wet watercolor paper, and then I'm going to bring some color over. And I'm going to let you see how that threads out and bleeds out, and then I'm going to pick up some blue, come in from the bottom and let that connect a little bit in the middle there. I have fun with that. I'm going to bring a little bit of red in there for fun. Okay, so that was wet on wet. Next you want to have a little napkin handy, kind of fold it up so you can do a little bit of dabbing with your napkin. So again, I'm going to get that blue, and I'm going to get kind of a flat wash again coming down to just tip the paper slightly so it washes down nicely. And now we're going to actually get a cool little effect of making some clouds. So while the paint is still nice and wet, you're going to get your napkin and just start to take some of the color out and create some little white fluffy clouds. Alright, we'll let that dry. See those little clouds? That's so cute. I love it. Alright, next we can go back to using our purple. Oops, right there. Okay, so next we're going to use our salt. So we want to make sure we get a nice coat of wet paint on here. And while it's still nice and saturated with water, I'm going to grab a little bit of a salt and just sprinkle it on there. And this creates a really fun texture. I like that a lot. So what it does is it starts to push the color away. And once it dries, the salt will drop off, and we'll see what it looks like in a little bit once it dries off. It's kind of cool. Alright, so I'm going to get myself some bright red going on here for our next technique. Just leave that there for a second with all that colour on there. Next I'm going to grab my oil pastel. I've got a white oil pastel. As I said before, you can also use a white crayon. And I'm just going to create a little design in here. And then the magic happens. I love that. That just makes me really happy. As you can see, once again, it's pushing the paint away, which is the oil in the crayon. Creates that resist, pushing away the color. All right. And next we want actually a very dry brush. So you want to take your brush out, kind of dry off some of that moisture. So we're going to try this technique, which is a dry brush technique. Actually need a little bit on there just to pick up my color. Kind of a muddy grey. Take some of that moisture off. So this can look like dry grass. So that's a real nice texture, isn't it? It looks really like a lot of dry grass growing up. You could put that in your painting at some point in the background. All right, so again, I'm just gonna put a bunch of color. I think I want to pick up some of that orange now. I haven't used our orange yet. I'm just gonna get a nice wash, and then I'm gonna let that dry and move on to the next technique, and then we'll come back to this one. So we'll just fill that with color and let that dry off a little bit. Okay, cool. So on this last little section here, I'm going to pick up some of my vibrant green. I'm going to see if you can kind of pick up maybe 2 colors on the same brush, and then you're going to use some stippling. So stippling is when you bounce your brush on the paper or canvas, depending on what you're working on, and as you can see, it kind of creates this really cool foliage effect. Maybe it's the top of a tree or some bushes in the background, and then you can pick up another slightly darker shade and create some shadows in there. A little bit of yellow in there too, more towards the top. Just mix that in there a little bit. Like there's some light reflecting off the top there, the side. There we go, that's fun. Okay, this still needs a little bit more time to dry, so I'm going to show you a little bit of splattering, which is a fun one. We can do that on, I think maybe up here would be kind of cool. Let's see. Pick up some very dark blues. I'm just going to flick the brush on there, and that creates a cool bit of, this time you're going to need your straw handy. So I just want a lot of liquidy paint, and I'm going to just drop. A little tricky to get it off the brush. You have to make sure you have enough on there. Just want to get like a droplet on there to work with a little bit more. Alright, let's work with that, see what happens. So here I'm just going to blow it along. Okay, there we go. Now it looks a little bit more like branches. I like that. I'm cool with that. You get the idea. I'm sure you'll have a much better go than me. There we go. So I'm just going to kind of work with it a little bit. So basically once that's dry, you could add some of this cool stippling effect onto the very tops of that, and there you have a beautiful tree. All right, so hopefully this is dry enough now for me to just do a little bit of that dry brush technique on top of dry paint. So again, kind of push out the bristles a little bit, make sure the brush is dry, pick up some color, and then you can use it. All right. Okay, cool. So next we can use all of these techniques in our artwork. Okay, so I've got a clean piece of watercolor paper. I've got my exercises that I just completed to learn lots of different watercolor techniques, and I'm going to use that on this first piece of art. So I'm going to start with just sketching around my hand again. I'm going to use our colored marker later to draw some patterns over the watercolor blend that we're going to do first. Okay, so what I'm thinking I want to do is start by completely wetting the inside of the hand, so we can do the wet on wet technique. And then once that dries, I'm going to use my fine point marker to create all those cool patterns that I came up with earlier when I was just doing my little pencil drawing. So just completely saturate the inside of the hand, and then you can begin to bring in some color here. So because the paper is nice and wet, every time I bring the color on there, it just starts to kind of travel and create these little strands going out and connecting with the other colors that I'm bringing onto the watercolor paper. The point of this exercise is to practice some of the techniques that you have just learnt, and so we've decided to use the wet on wet and just kind of work on the colors connecting and blending together, and then we're going to let it dry completely and we're going to go over it with our patterns. Okay, so I'm just going to let that dry and then we'll come back in with our thin colored marker. Okay, so now we've had a little bit of drying time. I'm going to grab my fine point pen and start to go around the outline. Then I can begin to fill the hand with some of those cool patterns that I came up with earlier. There we go. So you see I've got a little smudge of watercolor on there. I could probably just wash that out with a little bit of water. So let's see if we can do that just for fun, so you can see that you can sometimes erase watercolor with a little bit of help from the water. Okay. Another option would be to kind of cut the hand out and re-glue it onto a new piece of white paper, but I think we can get a fair amount of that out. Nothing to worry about. There we go. Looks very cool. It reminds me of a hennaed hand, which I really love. That's really beautiful. Alright, so I've got a nice fresh piece of watercolor paper. I've still got my examples of all the techniques that I learned, and then I've got my watercolors. I've got a couple of puddles of blue and purple, and I'm going to be using the warm colors for my background and my cool colors for inside the hand, and I'm going to be using my texture techniques that I pulled from here. So once again I'm going to draw around my hand. Okay, so what I'd like to do is take my white crayon, you could also use your oil pastel, and I'm just going to draw around the edges of the outline of my hand, and what that will do is, as I'm putting my background colors, it will resist the background color stepping into the space where the hand is, because I'm going to be using my cool colors and my texture techniques inside the hand. So next I'm going to draw around the hand with my wax. Of course you can't really see what I'm doing right now because this is a white crayon on white paper, but once we start to put the color in the background, our nice warm colors, you will notice it a little more. So next I'm going to just put some water in each of my warm colors, just a little bit of water inside there so I can use that color. And I'm going to gradually let it travel down, blending each color together. I'll just show you how I like to do that. Get a nice layer of red on there. Let's wash off that color a little bit, and then I'm going to pick up some of that orange, and I'm just going to come down a little bit lower so that there should be a bit of white paper in between, and then I'm going to gradually move that color back up and let it overlap and blend nicely there. Okay, so let's bring some of that orange down to kind of move around those fingers. So I'm trying to keep my brush strokes mostly horizontal so that we get the traveling down of color all in the same direction. Obviously, there'll be moments where you'll need to change the direction of your paintbrush so that you can just move into those kind of tiny areas between the fingers. But the majority of the time, obviously if I didn't have the hand in the way, I could just take those swiping gestures side to side all the way down. It would be a lot easier and a lot more even. But as we're working around the hand, we kind of have to adapt a little bit and find ways around it and try and keep it somewhat blended and smooth. Alright, so I'm going to put that aside, let that dry for a little bit, and then we'll be back to paint the inside of the hand with our cool colors and our texture techniques. Alright, so now we've had a little bit of drying time on this. We're ready to work on the inside of the hand with I'm just using my cool colors, so the blue and the purple, and I want to start by just creating a cool design in the center of the hand, which will show up in a little while. Okay, let's place that there. Alright, so I'm going to start by working with some of my techniques here in the thumb. So I'm going to start off with a nice dark blue right at the very end of the thumb, and then I'm going to gradually grade it out. So remember how we did that? We have to keep washing the brush off and clearing off the color and gradually moving that down. This one I'm just going to do a flat wash and then come in with my napkins and make little paper towel clouds. So remember, we have to like tip the paper a little bit just to let that color wash down as evenly as possible. And we're going to use a little napkin here. Remember, we made those little clouds earlier. Alright, so I'm going to change over to my purple, and I want to bring some salt into this particular one, so I'm just going to kind of wet that down. And I'm going to grab that salt while it's still, just drop that in there. Once that dries off, you can just brush the salt away and you'll see how it's absorbed the paint. I think a little bit of complete wash, flat wash on one of the fingers, and then we'll let it dry and come back with some dry brushing on it. I'm going to let those two dry. I'm going to do two different techniques on there. Just take some of the pigment out a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little wash to the whole hand and then bring my colors through there. So this is wet on wet, so those colors are going to bleed together around the design perfectly. Alright, so now I want to do a little bit of splattering in here. And then I'm going to use a dry brush to do some dry brush technique and this finger here. Okay, so I'm trying to dry off the brush as much as possible, get a lot of that moisture out, and then I can pick up a little bit of that blue and just take the dry brush through there. Too much, just enough to get it some texture. And then just a little bit of stippling around the edges of the hand. Alright, so I'm going to give that a little bit of drying time again, and then I'm going to venture around with my black pen. Okay. This is Lauren Grace signing off with the Rainforest Art Project, changing the world, one piece of art at a time.